He could remember things and repeat them, and he could focus his energy into things, but he wasn't bright. Brains were not how he got where he was. So it's with this in mind that I ask you to handle his stories. My father used to talk freely of the white man to my sister and I more than myself, as they were much closer, but was always careful to not mention him in front of my mother and Philly. Philly would make fun of him relentlessly for his boogeyman, and my mother never knew of any of it. I suppose he was afraid of her, thinking he was crazy. I grew up hearing about the white man, who seemed to be a combination of all your typical boogeymen. He was capable of changing shape, but not color. In his regular form, he was vaguely humanoid but featureless, however he could change into actual people or animals. He was old, and not stupid, but still more animal than man. He chose people, followed them, and brought bad luck to them. And most importantly, he liked to make deals. The white man wasn't a Grim Reaper sword, but he was a predator who showed up when a person was about to die or was hurt, and it was such that my father first saw him. Now pardon if this isn't told that well. I admit, I have little flair for stories, and I have not heard any of these old tales in a long time, so a few details may be missing. One year, about January, my father and Philly went .55, come April. He and I were never close, although we had no bad blood between us either. We just had nothing in common, and I never cared, perhaps assuming we'd always have time to form a relationship later on. He wasn't unhealthy, so I never put much effort into going out and visiting him, and in fact, I hadn't. Past tense is hard to get used to, seeing them in 3 years. Possibly I'm feeling guilty for never showing interest in my father. Perhaps I just miss him and want to talk about him. But tonight, I want to tell you a story about my father, and maybe get some information on a thing he called the white man. Just to tell you now, we're not Native American, and the white man didn't steal his land. My father was a very typical suburban dad, and frankly very boring. He had typical dad interests, like fishing and hunting and bowling. He wore Crocs and turtlenecks and drove a hatchback with a custom license plate. Despite his very upper middle class white dad exterior, though, he was a hick. A major hick. You see, my dad grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the 60s in a family that was dirt poor and very religious. I never met most of my extended family on his side aside from his brother, Philly, who becomes pretty important in this story, but from what I heard about them I gather they were deliverance on ice. They lived in what had once been a cabin in the woods. They raised pigs and chickens and sold lumber for most of their income. His father beat my father and his siblings during drunken bouts, which left my father with some major scars, mostly physically, but a few pretty obvious mental ones, too. What's important to note is that my father wasn't bright. He wasn't creative. He wasn't a storyteller. He could remember things and repeat them, and he could focus his energy into things, but he wasn't bright. Brains were not how he got where he was. So it's with this in mind that I ask you to handle his stories. My father used to talk freely of the white man to my sister and I more than myself, as they were much closer, but was always careful to not mention him in front of my mother and Philly. Philly would make fun of him relentlessly for his boogeyman, and my mother never knew of any of it. I suppose he was afraid of her, thinking he was crazy. I grew up hearing about the white man, who seemed to be a combination of all your typical boogeymen. He was capable of changing shape, but not color. In his regular form, he was vaguely humanoid but featureless, however he could change into actual people or animals. He was old, and not stupid, but still more animal than man. He chose people, followed them, and brought bad luck to them. And most importantly, he liked to make deals. The white man wasn't a Grim Reaper sort, but he was a predator who showed up when a person was about to die or was hurt, and it was such that my father first saw him. Now pardon if this isn't told that well. I admit, I have little flair for stories and I have not heard any of these old tales in a long time, so a few details may be missing. One year, about January, my father and Philly went out into the woods to go hunting. The two were about 10 and 9 respectively, although Philly was apparently the leader. They wandered further from their home than usual and it quickly got dark, which led to them getting disorientated and lost. What had initially begun as a simple afternoon hunt was now potentially life-threatening, for they didn't have the gear to easily survive the night. Things got worse though when the ground beneath my uncle gave away, revealing that in the dark they had wandered onto a pond which had frozen over and been covered by snow, but couldn't handle the weight of the two boys. My father, being as I said, a bit stupid, took a moment to react to the situation before he began trying to help his brother out. After a short struggle, during which time my father got soaked as well, they managed to get Philly out of the water, although they were both now exhausted and wet and truly had no idea where they were, for there wasn't a pond anywhere near their house. The two eventually managed to get off the pond and into the woods in an effort to find shelter or their home. Eventually they found a crevice beneath a tree and ducked into it for shelter, although it wasn't big enough for them to both fit at once. Being the drier of the two, my father volunteered to take the first shift out in the cold while his brother tried to dry off in the crevice. Now here the story splits. The more reasonable one is Philly's version. He dozed off. My father woke him up a while later. Told him they should keep moving. They did, kept wandering until they saw lights. Those lights were... They met up with the neighbors, went home. Their dad beat them. The hillbillies were all happy except my dad because he was crazy. And then there's my father's version. My father told me he sat out there, scanning the horizon and listening carefully for anything moving in the woods. Animals may mean better shelter or danger, and the person or some sort of vehicle meant rescue. After about 20 minutes he begins to hear something. Footsteps. According to him, it sounded like a large man and not all that far away, although he couldn't see anything, which surprised him a bit, as it wasn't all that dark, and even back then most people wandering in the woods tried to wear at least one bright item on them to avoid getting shot. But despite that, the noise got louder and louder until he finally saw it. A figure as white as snow walking through the trees towards him. It was clear to him that it wasn't human, and he described it as being about 9 feet tall and shaped like Gumby. It had 2 arms, 2 legs and 2 eyes, but no features. Everything was rounded. Scared to move, my father sat as still as he could, although it was clear the thing had already seen him. Slowly, it moved towards him and began to speak. When it spoke, it didn't speak with a mouth. Instead, it was just words one heard and one responded the same. What that means, is up to you to decide. Next response will be faster, was trying to decide where to cut this shit off. The order of the conversation and the length I'm not sure of, but it told him that it was an old thing that lived in the cold and that it needed them. It came whenever people got too cold or too lost or hurt from animals or accidents, and it took them away if something else had it already. It had no interest in the dead, just the dying. Conversing with it was unsettling, but not unpleasant according to my father. With that, it told him to get up so he could get his brother, and then they were to follow him away. My father, of course, refused and demanded they be left. Why, though, the thing asked. You'll just freeze anyway, so it doesn't matter. Still though he refused to move, and eventually the thing asked him why he was so stubborn. It sounded a bit surprised, as if most people didn't argue much. I just don't want to die or have him die, was the best my father could come up with. Then we'll need to make a deal. My father told me the thing, which never, not over any of their visits, told him its name, if it had one, talked like a car dealer or game show host. It tried to convince him what he really wanted, what he really needed. Wouldn't it be easier to go with him? Wouldn't that be simpler? But still my father refused. Eventually, they settled. They would get out, but their lives would be on loan. It would be owed interest, and one day it would still come for them. The thing, which he eventually began calling the white man, then began to walk off. Although it didn't say anything to him, my father said he understood that he was being let out now and that he should follow it. He then woke up Philly and the two headed off. Of course, you'd think he'd have been more suspicious of following a giant snow monster that had already tried to kidnap him, but my father wasn't bright or likely a great storyteller either. Before Philly was even awake though, the monster had disappeared, the giant footsteps vanishing. At first, my father thought for sure he'd been cheated or simply abandoned, before realizing there was a trail of rabbit prints, which he began following instead, somehow understanding that somehow, those belonged to the monster. Occasionally, he'd catch a glimpse of an all-white rabbit, and it was then he understood the thing could change shape. After a while, they saw the lights of their neighbors in the distance and headed towards them. Of course, as a kid, the story was a lot scarier, and I'm sure I'm missing a few details. Even then though, I understood the plot holes and how far-fetched it was. My mother used to tell stories of how her childhood home had been haunted, all while telling us ghosts didn't exist. So I assumed this was similar. A tall tale. Now before I keep going, I want to say a couple of things. First off, I don't really believe my father's stories, although I think he believed them for some reason or another. I just thought you guys would get a kick out of them, and that maybe there's some Uper legend Google didn't pull up that he adapted this from. I also want to say that my uncle, again, thought this was all a load of shit. When he would tell the story, it was just a story of how they got lost, almost died and eventually got home to an ass whooping. A few things my father added and he did agree on though. There were rabbit footprints, and possibly some bigger ones, although these looked like indents in the snow tomb rather than actual prints, and my father did end up following a rabbit which could have been white or blue for all he remembers out at one point, which he thought was stupid even then. My uncle also didn't hear anything of the white man, not until my father saw him again a year after they got lost. My father's excuse for not sharing this story with him was either he'd think I was crazy, or think he was going to die, and only the shock of the next incident scared the story out of him. A year passed and my father began to think he had maybe gone crazy that night, or that he had fallen asleep and dreamt it and just woke up without realizing it. That is, until one night, again winter, again with snow on the ground, he was out tending to the hogs alone with his dog. As a boy, my father had only two close friends. Philly and this dog, a Basset Beagle mix named Shorty. This was a fact he repeated time and again during many stories of his childhood, which always made me wonder how his sisters felt. Were they not close? Guess not, since I never met them. Anyway, they're in the pig barn, which was far enough away from their house that in the summer implying there is one the smell of shit and pigs didn't waft indoors. The barn was capable of being opened on both sides, and in the warmer months the back would be left open so that the hogs could enjoy the outdoors, while in the colder months it'd be closed up tight. So of course, my father was a little